Good evening, and welcome to our program. Tonight, we delve into a question that has fascinated and troubled experts for decades. Are psychopaths born or made? It's a complex issue that sits at the intersection of nature and nurture, genetics and environment. We aim to explore the different facets of this debate. Joining us are two distinguished experts. Dr. Ben Carter, a neuroscientist who will argue for the biological underpinnings, and Dr. Emily Hayes, a clinical psychologist who will emphasize environmental factors. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here. My position is that while the environment undoubtedly plays a role in how traits are expressed, the foundational elements of psychopathy are primarily rooted in biology. We have substantial evidence from genetic studies indicating a significant heritable component to psychopathic traits. Certain gene variants, particularly those involved in neurotransmitter function and emotional regulation, have been identified as being more prevalent in individuals diagnosed with psychopathy. Furthermore, neuroimaging research consistently reveals distinct structural and functional differences in the brains of psychopaths. For example, there's often reduced activity and volume in the amygdala, a key area for processing fear and other emotions. We also observe abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and moral reasoning. These aren't subtle differences. They point to a brain that is wired differently from the outset. Twin studies are particularly compelling. Studies comparing identical twins who share 100% of their genes with fraternal twins who share about 50% consistently show higher concordance rates for psychopathic traits among identical twins. This strongly suggests a genetic predisposition. While a challenging upbringing might exacerbate these tendencies, the underlying blueprint, the predisposition, is, in my view, largely biological.
Thank you, Sarah and Dr. Carter. While I acknowledge that biological vulnerabilities may exist, my clinical experience and a vast body of research lead me to argue that psychopathy is predominantly a developmental outcome, significantly shaped by environmental experiences. The impact of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, cannot be overstated. We consistently find that individuals who develop psychopathic traits have often endured severe trauma, chronic neglect, or profound abuse during their formative years. These experiences can have a devastating effect on a child's developing brain and their capacity for empathy, attachment, and emotional regulation. Dysfunctional family environments, characterized by inconsistent parenting, lack of warmth, or exposure to violence, create a breeding ground for maladaptive behaviors. Children in such environments may learn that manipulative or aggressive behaviors are necessary for survival or for getting their needs met. They may develop a worldview where trust is impossible and exploiting others is a rational strategy. So while some individuals might have certain predispositions, it's often the severe and chronic environmental stressors that act as the critical triggers, shaping these vulnerabilities into the full-blown characteristics we associate with psychopathy. The making of a psychopath, I believe, is a tragic developmental process.
Thank you both for those clear opening statements. Dr. Hayes, you've compellingly outlined the impact of early trauma. Dr. Carter, how does the PON perspective account for individuals with supposed genetic markers for psychopathy who don't actually develop the disorder? Conversely, what about those who exhibit psychopathic traits but lack these known genetic predispositions?
That's a crucial question, Sarah. The presence of genetic markers doesn't equate to a deterministic outcome. It signifies a predisposition or vulnerability. Think of it like a loaded gun. The genetic makeup might provide the gun and the bullets, but an environmental factor often needs to pull the trigger. So some individuals with these genetic markers may be fortunate enough to experience a supportive environment that mitigates the risk. Protective factors can play a significant role. Regarding those without known markers, our understanding of the genetic basis is still evolving. There may be other genes or complex interactions we haven't yet identified. Additionally, phenocopies, conditions that resemble genetically determined ones but are caused by environmental factors, can exist. However, the core, profound lack of empathy and specific neural correlates are more consistently tied to biological underpinnings in primary psychopathy.
That's an interesting point about phenocopies. Dr. Carter has pointed to specific brain differences as evidence for the quote, born theory. From your perspective, Dr. Hayes, are these structural or functional differences necessarily the cause of psychopathy? Or could they be a consequence of prolonged exposure to negative environments, or even a result of engaging in psychopathic behaviors over time?
That's the classic chicken or egg dilemma in this field, Sarah. While Dr. Carter highlights brain differences, it's important to consider brain plasticity, especially during development. Prolonged exposure to extreme stress, neglect, or trauma can alter brain structure and function. For instance, chronic fear or lack of nurturing care can impact the development of the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, the very areas Dr. Carter mentioned. It's plausible that these brain anomalies are, in many cases, scars left by a harsh environment, rather than pre-existing conditions. Furthermore, engaging in certain behaviors can also shape the brain. If an individual consistently suppresses empathy, or engages in manipulative tactics, this could reinforce certain neural pathways and prune others, leading to the observed differences. So the brain findings, while important, don't exclusively point to an innate cause.
This leads us naturally to the interplay between these factors. Both of you have acknowledged that it might not be a strict either/or situation. Could you elaborate on how genetic predispositions and environmental factors might interact to lead to the development of psychopathy? Dr. Carter, perhaps you could start by explaining how genetic vulnerabilities might make individuals more susceptible to negative environmental impacts.
Certainly, this is where the diathesis stress model becomes highly relevant. Individuals with a genetic predisposition, the diathesis, may be more sensitive to adverse environmental factors, the stress. For example, a child with a genetic variant affecting serotonin regulation, which is implicated in impulse control and mood, might be more profoundly affected by an unstable or abusive home environment than a child without that variant. Their inherent biological makeup could make it harder for them to cope with such stressors, potentially leading to the development of callous unemotional traits as a maladaptive coping mechanism. The environment essentially activates or amplifies the latent genetic risk.
And Dr. Hayes, from your perspective, how might severe or prolonged environmental stressors affect brain development or even gene expression related to empathy and impulse control?
Environmental factors can have a profound impact, extending to the level of gene expression through epigenetic mechanisms. Severe stress or trauma, particularly in early life, can lead to changes in how genes are switched on or off, without altering the DNA sequence itself. These epigenetic changes can affect genes involved in stress response systems, emotional regulation, and brain development. For example, chronic neglect might lead to the downregulation of genes responsible for oxytocin receptors, which are crucial for bonding and empathy. So, a harsh environment doesn't just provide negative learning experiences. It can physically sculpt the developing brain and alter its functional pathways, potentially leading to the deficits in empathy and impulse control characteristic of psychopathy. It's a dynamic interplay.
Given this interactionist view, what are the brief implications for prevention or intervention that either of you see?
From a biological standpoint, if we can identify early markers of vulnerability, interventions could focus on creating highly supportive and enriched environments to mitigate those risks before psychopathic traits become entrenched.
And on the environmental side, it underscores the critical need for early intervention programs for at-risk children and families, focusing on positive parenting, trauma-informed care, and building resilience. Preventing those early adverse experiences is key.
In summary, while the journey to developing psychopathy is undeniably complex and involves environmental interactions, I maintain that the fundamental predispositions are significantly rooted in our biology and genetics. The neurological differences we observe in brain structure and function, such as in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, are not trivial. They suggest an inherent variance in how these individuals process emotions and make decisions. While a nurturing environment can buffer some risks and a harsh one can exacerbate them, the inherent biological framework lays a critical foundation. Future research should continue to explore early biological markers. Perhaps, very cautiously, one day we might even consider highly targeted biological interventions for those at extreme risk, though this raises profound ethical considerations. But understanding the biological basis remains paramount.
To conclude, I reiterate that while biological vulnerabilities can play a part, the development of psychopathy is heavily influenced by environmental factors and developmental pathways. The making of a psychopath often involves a history of trauma, neglect, or dysfunctional upbringing. These experiences shape not only behavior but also, as we've discussed, brain development and potentially even gene expression. The lack of nurture, the absence of secure attachment, and the learning of maladaptive coping strategies are powerful forces. Therefore, our focus for research and intervention should be heavily weighted towards creating protective environments, implementing effective early interventions for at-risk children and families, and understanding the societal factors that may contribute to these developmental tragedies. Prevention is where our greatest hope lies.
Thank you, Dr. Carter and Dr. Hayes, for this incredibly insightful and nuanced discussion. It's clear that the question of whether psychopaths are born or made doesn't have a simple answer. Instead, it appears to be a complex interplay of genetic predispositions and environmental influences, a continuing area of vital research. The dialogue tonight has certainly illuminated the many facets of this debate. We appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. That's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you for joining us.